King Cryan's household was complicated. His first concubine, Anisha, remained neutral in palace politics and thus became an outcast among the royal women. The second concubine, Elis, was a loyal supporter of the current queen. Winry and Varys, the twin children of Anisha, were half-siblings to Davey, the first prince. Varys stood awkwardly in the center of the room, still holding his unruly sister aloft, and apologized for the interruption. Winry's face was twisted in displeasure as she wriggled to free herself. When Varys finally questioned her behavior, she gave a sharp glance to the side, huffed, and landed on her feet, barely keeping her balance by spreading her arms wide. She immediately cursed him for his outburst, and before long, the twins were bickering fiercely. Electric sparks seemed to fill the air as their shouting escalated. Davey, now standing beside Amy, watched the scene with a mix of amusement and nostalgia, remarking that the two hadn't changed at all. Fists clenched, they argued over who was the elder sibling, showing none of the polished manners of royal heirs unlike Lyn's children. Eventually, both twins turned to Davey, eyes filled with expectation, as though waiting for him to act as judge in their quarrel. Observing their behavior, Davey's thoughts softened. They were still good-hearted, still deeply attached to him, and, most importantly, they trusted him without hesitation. Later, 3 cups were set upon the table. Davey lounged back in his chair while the twins sat together on the couch, their tea untouched, discussing the affairs of the castle during Davey's long coma. The mood was subdued, their expressions downcast. Davey remembered that when he had fallen into his coma, Winry and Varys had been only 8 years old, far too young to influence the tides of palace politics. They had been powerless then, unable to protect themselves, especially after Anisha's first daughter, Talia, had been sent to another country due to one of Lyn's schemes. At the very least, Anisha had ensured the twins remained safe within the palace. Determined to lift their spirits, Davey offered them a few words of encouragement. The effect was immediate. Their expressions brightened, if only slightly. Picking up his cup of tea, Davey asked with a deliberately casual tone whether they had seen their father recently. The twins exchanged glances before replying that they had visited the king just before coming to see him. When Davey inquired about his father, Varys paused, recalling that the king had seemed a little weary. Before he could continue, Winry cut in, eyes wide with disbelief, asking if Davey truly had not seen his father yet. Davey answered calmly that he would meet him one day. The princess's face shifted into a mixture of sadness and puzzlement for her brother, her words faltering into silence. The pause allowed Varys to change the subject, speaking of the palace's deteriorating state, deep cracks creeping up the stucco walls. Lifting a teacup in one hand and steadying the saucer with the other, Davey offered a small, steady smile. He explained that certain individuals had been caught embezzling funds from the royal treasury, but assured them that order would soon be restored. Varys's expression darkened. He slammed a hand against the table, unable to restrain his anger at the thieves. His hand trembled with tension, and both twins were instantly fired with a thirst for justice, eager to take matters into their own hands. Davey, however, took a measured sip of tea and told them not to interfere. Varys bristled at the restraint, attempting to resist Davey's will, but his fury ebbed quickly, leaving behind only an expression of indignation. Davey remained composed, tea in hand, reassured by his own ability to resolve matters without unnecessary involvement. He took quiet satisfaction in knowing that, now more than ever, there were many on his side. With the mood settled, Davey turned the conversation toward Winry's magical talents. The green-haired siblings quickly reignited their bickering, this time over the elimination of a local gang. Davey stayed seated, an observer to their escalating argument, until a mention of fencing competitions caught his attention. The word alone was enough to halt their quarrel at least momentarily before it threatened to erupt again. Winry and Varys, caught up in their own banter, tossed mugs in jest while Davey waited silently for an explanation. Eventually, Varys cleared his throat, raising a fist to his lips as he gathered his thoughts. From within his coat, he produced a sealed envelope and handed it to Davey. The letter revealed details of the prestigious fencing competition held every 6 years to maintain harmony across the continent. This year's tournament would take place in the Principality of Feli. After skimming its contents, Davey noted the diverse range of participants and glanced up at Varys, who gravely urged him not to miss this opportunity, especially since a formal request had already been sent to the king. Winry, brimming with excitement, pushed her twin forward, encouraging him to convince Davey to join. The mention of Feli stirred a memory. Davey recalled it as a breathtaking city of water. While the twins pressed their case with enthusiasm, Davey simply held the letter in one hand, watching their playful but heated exchange. A single cough from him was enough to draw both their eyes. With a faint smile, he agreed to their proposal. The twins erupted with joy, tossing mugs and saucers into the air in celebration. Davey cursed their lack of restraint, but couldn't help smiling at their genuine happiness. As he watched them, Davey was reminded of how little it took to make the two of them truly content. Yet Varys' earlier words lingered in his mind because it was true. Davey had never once stepped beyond the palace walls. Davey gazed at the sky, admiring the way the clouds drifted lazily across the vast blue. In his hands, he turned an envelope over, lifting it to his face with a dreamy smile. The thought of the upcoming competition stirred a quiet anticipation. It promised to be far more interesting than most expected. The scene shifted to the king's private chambers. A finely wrought teapot poured steaming tea into an ornate cup set with gemstones. The black and gold room exuded opulence, every detail meticulously arranged. On the round table, 2 teacups rested, one already filled. As the teapot was set aside, Vipos spoke with the king, noting how much the latter's son, Davey, had matured. The king, recalling their last meeting, described the first prince as shrewd, cold-blooded, and very much grown. Vipos waited respectfully for his next order as the king reached for his cup. He asked the old retainer whether he recognized the man Davey had become. Through the window, the king could be seen seated at the table, a blue robe draped over him and a red mantle across his shoulder. Once a figure of imposing strength, he now looked weary, his face shadowed by illness. On a nearby shelf, beneath a row of books, sat a golden globe, an ornate box, and a framed portrait. The painting depicted a young woman in a blue gown adorned with pearls and white lilies, her dark curls cascading elegantly over her shoulders. Davey, standing with his hands at his sides, studied the portrait with quiet satisfaction, deciding that at last everything felt right. The palace itself was transformed thanks to the tireless work of Chief Chamberlain Vipos. The servants had been replaced and the halls restored to their proper grandeur. In Davey's chambers, the air was brighter, cleaner, alive with renewed dignity. Amy clasped her hands to her face in delight, beaming as if this day were the culmination of a lifelong dream. Davey, standing beside her, regarded her excitement with disbelief and a faint, bittersweet smile. He wondered whether he had treated her poorly without realizing it. Before the thought could deepen, Amy's voice broke through, asking if he was ready. Davey affirmed, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 9. He asked if she had prepared everything, and then casually requested she bring him a bottle of alcohol. She froze, confused by the unusual request. Moments later, the doors to his chambers opened. With Amy at his side and the twins, Winry and Barris, in tow, Davey set out for the Principality of Feli. Above them, the royal banner snapped in the wind while blue confetti rained from the sky. The fencing competition awaited a spectacle drawing eyes and ears from across the world. Barris was determined to take part, and Davey, under the pretext of improving his health, had decided to accompany him. Crowds swarmed the castle grounds, the air electric with anticipation. Even if Davey himself could not compete, a victory for Barris would destabilize the position of the arrogant Callus. Queen Lind, confident in Barris's defeat, had permitted his participation without hesitation. From the opposite side of the courtyard, Davey crossed his arms, watching her intently. He warned her in a low voice not to attempt anything underhanded. The sound of footsteps heralded the king's arrival. Flanked by Vipas, King Cryans stepped forward, his red robe heavy with gold embroidery, his belt clasp gleaming. The people erupted in praise. Davey froze at the sight of his father. This was the first time they had stood in the same place since his awakening 6 months prior. Vipas discreetly adjusted the king's attire as Cryans lifted his hand toward the sky, commanding Baris to raise his head. The king's voice, though authoritative, carried the fatigue of a man worn by illness. He asked the fourth prince if he had confidence in his abilities. Kneeling before him, Baris answered with a proud smile, vowing to bring glory to the kingdom. Cryans placed a hand on his son's shoulder, blessing him to return safely. But as he turned to scan the crowd, his gaze fell on Davey. For a fleeting moment, the king's expression shifted to puzzlement. Davey stood beside Amy, his face an unreadable mask. Davey held his father's gaze, refusing to look away. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet resolve. When the king finally turned and walked away, Davey caught a fleeting shadow of sadness in his expression. Even so, the king noted his son's healthy appearance before disappearing into the distance, leaving Davey standing amidst the crowd with a discouraged look. Nearby, Winry glanced at him questioningly. Davey had thought that, after all this time, he would be immune to emotion, but reality proved otherwise. From the podium, a courtier dressed in deep red praised Varys before the gathered crowd. Behind him, the king sat upon his throne. Cryans had changed, no longer the vibrant, majestic monarch of memory. Now, he looked like a tired lion, surveying his people with weary eyes. The road stretched on in a ribbon flanked by trees. Inside the carriage, Davey rested his hand against his cheek, staring thoughtfully at the passing scenery. Varys and Winry, seated beside him, noticed his quiet mood and tried to distract him. He offered them a small, grateful smile, assuring them not to worry. The royal motorcade was flanked by the kingdom's finest warriors on horseback. Davey admitted he feared the twins might be bored, forced to ride in the carriage on his account. They dismissed the idea immediately. Winry, holding a half-filled glass, declared cheerfully that boredom was impossible with wine at hand, only for Varys to sharply remind her to pace herself. The sunlight caught in her glass as Davey, twirling his own, remarked that he didn't know the wine's origin. It had belonged to his mother. Hearing this, Varys hesitated, asking if something so precious should truly be consumed. Winry, realizing the weight of his words, fell silent. Davey, still gazing at the wine's glimmer, replied that such a day was perfect for it. Varys smiled sadly, remarking how much Davey had changed. Winry agreed without taking her eyes off him. Once, Davey had guarded every memory of his mother as though it were sacred, yet now, here he was, drinking her wine. A blush rose on his cheeks. The three raised their glasses together in a simple toast. Good wine is meant to be enjoyed, not hidden away. They drank to the bottom. Night fell over the forest as the carriage rolled on beneath 2 moons, a pale one and a smaller crimson satellite. The convoy halted, setting up camp. A fire burned in the clearing. Varys, weary, confided that calming Winry had been no small task. Standing behind Davey with a serious look, he told him to slow down on the drinking. Davey, seated on the ground, offered an apologetic smile. As they sat by the fire, Varys recalled Davey's childhood dream to journey through the wilderness and camp under the stars. Davey cradled a cup in his hands, eyes reflecting the firelight, as Varys explained that he had reduced the number of guards to preserve the spirit of the trip. The moons hung above them, one massive and blue, the other small and red as the carriage stood nearby, kept for Davey's health, though such journeys were usually made on horseback. Somewhere far away, the king sat upon a throne ringed by cruel iron spikes. Back at camp, the Gemini twins beamed with joy, satisfied that Davey was enjoying himself. Waving goodbye, Varys departed. Davey leaned back, hands behind his head, gazing at the night sky. Amy approached, asking if it wasn't time for him to rest. Davey's answer came with a gentle smile. Tonight was too beautiful to waste, with 2 moons shining together. In the dark canopy, a dry branch snapped. Its end caught a faint glow as Davey swung it, stirring the air. The tip pulsed with a stream of blue energy. Above, the red moon and the great blue one shone in silent majesty. Pointing upward, a warrior named the Scarlet Moon Zos and the Azure Moon Cruz. Another warrior explained, Zos heralds beginnings, while Cruz marks endings. A voice from the shadows called the soldier clever only for the camp to erupt in laughter, for everyone knew this tale. Between the two moons stretched a glittering river of stars, the galaxy watching over them all. A voice called from the bushes, interrupting the satisfied soldiers' muttering. The men in red uniforms stood frozen, bewildered, behind a grinning Davey, who lounged in the shadows with a look of quiet malice. Whispers rippled through the ranks, some wondered if they had seen a ghost. Hidden from sight, Davey had cloaked himself with illusion magic. Slipping deeper into the trees, he idly swung a worn stick in his hand, pondering the strength of the castle guards. The stick's tip was already frayed from repeated strikes against the hardened training posts known as Kriyas. He concluded that the strength of 5 disciplined soldiers would suffice at least until a truly dire threat arose. Peering through the circle of his fingers, Davey spotted movement in the forest. Perched silently in a tree, he saw them, 20 black-clad mercenaries moving like shadows, their faces hidden beneath masks. They moved with precision, their formation too disciplined to be anything but deliberate. It was unmistakable this was the work of Queen Lind, who had clearly chosen this moment to rid herself of Davey, Winry, and Barrys in one decisive strike. A blade sliced through the foliage. Davey, still armed only with his stick, smiled faintly and swung. The weapon flared with blue energy, and in one swift motion he cleaved through both attackers and the surrounding branches. Bodies crumpled against the dark silhouettes of the trees. Before he could take a breath, a second wave of mercenaries closed in. Davey's grip tightened as his teacher's words echoed in his mind, any object can be a weapon. He swung his stick in a wide arc, weaving shimmering patterns of magic in the air, channeling power with precision. His gaze hardened. They were nothing compared to Harish, the one who had taught him how to kill. One mercenary fell to his knees, clutching a wound. Davey stood with unshakable calm, even as more surrounded him from behind. Draping one arm casually over his shoulder, he looked at them with a mocking half-smile. "So," he said, his tone dripping with disdain, "Queen Lind sent you." The mercenaries remained silent, not even flinching. Davey exhaled in mild disappointment. With another swing, his stick traced a glowing arc through the air. In an instant, he was behind one of the masked fighters, deciding that their answer or lack thereof was irrelevant. What mattered now was why the queen believed she could act without consequence. Far away, in a dimly lit palace room bathed in the glow of scarlet candles, a servant girl moved silently. Outside, the night mist swirled. Back in the forest, the battle raged on. After cutting down nearly all of his foes, Davey left a pair of mercenaries trembling in fear. He told them to deliver a message to their employer. But one, eyes blazing with resolve, stepped forward to attack. Davey advanced, the stick balanced across his shoulder. Then he stopped, a predatory smile curling his lips. He leapt into the air. Light erupted from his weapon, streaks of magic and lightning filling the night. The mercenaries had no chance by the time the glow faded. Silence had claimed the clearing. One lifeless body lay at Davey's feet. "Patience," Davey said coolly, towering over the fallen ninja, "is the key to secret killing." A faint, pained voice rose from the ground. "And what does that mean?" Davey didn't hesitate. "With the final strike," he answered. "It means no one will ever know who did it." Davey turned his gaze away, excitement flashing in his eyes. 2 mercenaries lunged at him with blades drawn, while a third attempted to flee. Out of the corner of his vision, Davey noticed a ninja slipping into the forest. Without hesitation, he unleashed a torrent of magic, striking down 2 enemies in a single blast. He didn't bother to look back at the lifeless bodies. To him, they weren't even worth the effort of lifting a stick. Extending his index finger, he took careful aim at the deserter. The soldier's figure was perfectly centered in his sight. With a snap of his fingers, arcs of lightning surged forward, coursing through the mercenary's body and leaving it twitching with violent discharges. The forest fog concealed the corpse, only a faint shimmer of magical energy lingering above it. Cold-blooded and merciless, Davey felt no remorse for those who had sought his life. Placing one boot on a branch and folding his hands behind his head, he walked away as though nothing had happened. Behind him, the battlefield lay silent, strewn with corpses and shattered weapons. Elsewhere, Queen Lin sat with her back against a tall green chair. In a calm voice, she asked how the mission had gone. A blindfolded servant girl hesitated, then began to recount the events. Around them, countless candles flickered on the floor, each one tied to the hearts of the queen's maidservants. One by one, the flames snuffed out, leaving behind only a faint haze. When Lin, seated at a small round table, asked whether all the enemies had been eliminated, the girl confirmed it with a nod. Lifting her teacup, the queen casually inquired about the fate of Davey and the twins. The servant answered that the royal motorcade should already have arrived in the Phi Principality. In an instant, Lin's composure shattered. She rose abruptly and struck the girl across the face, her fury radiating through the chamber. Unable to restrain herself, she shouted at her subordinate, demanding to know what she planned to do with the 3 teenagers and the 5 knights. Her anger boiled over furniture splintered and crashed to the floor as she raged that 24 assassins had been wiped out, condemning the Black Moon Guild as useless. The servant, cheek marked red from the blow, lowered her head and admitted that the mercenaries had only sought to confirm the details of what had happened. But one fact was undeniable. Prince Davey possessed far greater power than anyone had anticipated. Lin's expression twisted into a snarl. Slamming her fist against the table, she ordered her servant to uncover every detail about the prince's backers. She vowed to make an example of anyone foolish enough to challenge her authority. With a commanding tone, she reminded the girl that she had dealt with the guild directly and would not shield them from failure. Her voice sharpened with menace. This mistake, she warned, must never happen again. If it did, she would tear apart the contract and see the Black Moon Guild destroyed, even if it meant using the full strength of her nation and the Barrett Duchy. High above the castle towers, a red and blue satellite glimmered faintly in the night sky, casting a ghostly glow over the sleeping city. Darkness gave way to dawn, and soon the sun shone brightly in a cloudless sky. Inside the royal carriage, Winry leaned eagerly toward the window, calling Davey's attention to the breathtaking view of the Phi Principality. Meanwhile, the twins bickered endlessly, their voices filling the air. Davey ignored them, silently admiring the passing scenery. At last, he concluded they had arrived. Known as the City of Water, Phi Principality resembled Earth's Singapore, a small, prosperous city-state rich with ancient ruins. It was considered one of the most captivating and beautiful places on the entire continent. Davey's eyes widened as he gazed at the canals, the dancing fountains, and the vibrant buildings. He glanced at his brother Boris, whose pleased expression mirrored his own. As they approached the gleaming white arena, the twins' Coliseum, Davey realized it was the site of the upcoming Continental Fencing Tournament. Traditionally used for blood sport, this stadium was infamous for brutal gladiatorial matches against beasts and men alike. To Davey, it was needless savagery. Walking along the paved road together, Winry asked Boris whether she knew how many would be competing. Boris replied that only 8 nations would be sending their finest representatives. As the green-haired prince spoke with enthusiasm, Davey frowned in clear displeasure. He could already tell that the 2 nations were only trying to gauge each other's strength. Without slowing down, the trio continued their discussion about the upcoming Young Generation tournament. Winry suddenly stopped, pointed at her twin brother, and sarcastically remarked that their kingdom was being represented by this fool. Barry looked annoyed, but Winry went on, saying she had traveled to the City of Water not to support her brother, but to meet Davey instead. The first prince appeared quite pleased by this. Barry's abilities, though, were nothing to dismiss. He stood at the mid-level of an expert and the lower level of a swordmaster, an incredible feat for his age. Winry then grew thoughtful as she recalled that the Palin Empire would be sending none other than the famous Sword Princess. This revelation puzzled Davey. The girl was surprised her brothers had never heard of such a renowned figure, since she believed there wasn't a single person in the kingdom who didn't know of her. Davey, however, was unsettled as he searched his memory. Clearly, during the 6 years he had spent in a hero's coma, new names and legends had risen. Elena Delan, the Sword Princess, was the sole daughter among the Emperor's 9 children and his greatest pride. Barry explained that her fame did not come solely from her title as the Empire's only princess. What made her legendary was the weapon she wielded, the divine sword. At this, Davey froze in shock. Winry patiently explained to her bewildered companions that this sword was once the favored blade of the ancient hero, the sword god Hare's. The divine sword Caldera's. Davey's thoughts immediately drifted back. It had been years since he'd heard that name. With its golden hilt and pale stone, Caldera's was unforgettable. The sword god Hare's, Davey's very first instructor in swordsmanship, had been a notoriously lazy teacher, but his skills were unmatched. He often spoke endlessly about the sword, to the point of annoyance. That blade, it was said, was the very weapon that had struck down the Demon King. 3 cloaked figures soon appeared, walking up the stone staircase. Unlike Davey, Master Hare's had originally come from this place, so naturally traces of his memory lingered here. As Davey strolled arm in arm with his sister, unease crept over him. Suddenly, a hooded girl in a long raincoat brushed past. The stranger briefly turned toward Davey with a smile. When asked about the matter, the blonde girl delayed her reply. She touched the golden sword pendant hanging at her neck before finally murmuring that it was nothing. Still, the thought of the divine sword weighed heavily on them. It was said that even after 1,000 years, its blade remained intact. Rumors claimed that Caldera's had developed an ego of its own, becoming self-sustaining with magic. The ego of a sword was the lingering will of its wielder's soul, bound forever within the weapon. Later, the 3 companions gathered around a dinner table, continuing their discussion about the Sword Princess and her legendary weapon. Folding his hands, Barry noted gravely that there was yet another reason Elena Delan was so famous. Davey raised a brow in curiosity. The green-haired prince adjusted his glasses and, with a sudden change in tone, began to describe Elena's breathtaking beauty. She was considered one of the greatest beauties on the entire continent. Davey, however, listened with visible annoyance. Adjusting the extravagant ribbon tied around his neck, he sighed and asked Amy if there were simpler clothes available. The striped ribbon felt suffocating. With tears in her eyes, the maid insisted that the outfit was already modest, especially since this was the prince's first time attending a royal reception. She reminded him that he represented the face of the kingdom. Davey thought bitterly to himself that he was only there as an observer. The fencing tournament itself was not merely about swordplay, it was a gathering place for the brightest young stars of every nation, a proving ground for future rulers. Still, countless unnecessary rules had been piled upon it. As the night sky glowed with brilliant lights near Krea's and Ciro's, the celebrations began. Winry and Barry appeared in exquisite attire to greet their brother. Davey, looking at his sister, compared her to a fairy. She smiled and returned the compliment, while the disgruntled green-haired prince quickly cut in, asking them not to overpraise her. The princess stomped hard on her twin brother's foot, cutting off his speech and leaving the already defeated Varys behind. Winry, however, quickly turned to Davey and asked him to become her escort. Davey, slightly amused, clarified whether she might have confused their roles. A man's gloved hand gently clasped a woman's palm, while in the background, a frustrated boy ran about angrily, shouting for them to wait. At the entrance, a servant greeted a red-haired lady dressed elegantly in a white evening gown with a polite handshake. The young woman remarked on the sweltering heat outside, though her gaze was fixed instead on a rose bush of striking beauty. As the servant spoke of the upcoming tournament, she briefly commented on the stadium, remarking simply that it was not bad. Holding a rose delicately in her hand, she sniffed its fragrance and added with faint amusement that it was not bad for mindless wildness. The scene shifted to a magnificent hall adorned with glittering chandeliers, golden moldings, and lavish decorations. A grand ball was underway, held on the eve of the tournament, bringing together nobles from across nations in hopes of forging valuable friendships. Davey stood with a glass of sparkling wine in hand, observing the contestants and their escorts gathered in the great hall. Most were quite young, though a few, like himself and Winry, were older. In one corner, red roses gleamed against the backdrop, while Varys, surrounded by several princesses introducing themselves, appeared flustered yet thrilled. From a distance, Davey watched his younger brother with quiet amusement, unsurprised by the attention he received. He noticed that Winry, too, had already found her circle of company. When Davey realized that his brother might need help, he considered stepping in but ultimately chose not to. Varys waved his arms wildly from the crowd, desperately trying to get his brother's attention, but Davey deliberately ignored him, leaving him to his fate. Instead, he turned away and took Winry's hand, leading her to the dance floor. The green-haired prince called after him, pleading for assistance, but Davey only grinned and wished him to enjoy his youth. Winry, meanwhile, could not hide her joy. At last, she had the chance to dance with her brother. As they moved gracefully across the floor, Davey complimented her skill, and she smiled, explaining that it had been a long time since her debut. She was now a true lady. Growing pensive, Winry asked if Davey ever felt regret for losing so much time during his coma. She quietly admitted that with his talent for swordsmanship, he might have even been able to enter the tournament. Davey chuckled awkwardly, asking if she thought too highly of him. He added with self-deprecation that it was impossible for him to have become a master by the age of 14. Casting his eyes toward his younger brother, now surrounded by new acquaintances, Davey began reflecting on the true nature of talent, hard work concealed behind natural ability. He thought to himself that, in his case, it had taken 1,000 years of effort. Surveying the lively hall around him, he gently concluded that he no longer found such gatherings meaningful. With a light laugh, he remarked that what he truly desired was to live in peace and prosperity. To Winry, this sounded like the response of an old man, but his words made her smile as she covered her face to hide her amusement. Their conversation was interrupted by a voice, surprised yet delighted, calling out to Princess Winry. A red-haired youth in a blue and white tailcoat approached, bowing with polite enthusiasm. Davey watched curiously, trying to place the young man. Winry's expression, however, soured the moment she recognized him. The red-haired noble wasted no time. Ignoring Davey entirely, he rushed to Winry, eagerly taking her hands and asking for her attention. Winry, clearly annoyed, pulled her hands away and curtly replied that she was already engaged in conversation with her brother. The youth clicked his tongue in irritation, lifting the corner of his lip with a faint sneer. With exaggerated disappointment, he questioned the princess's manners before formally introducing himself as Balan, the 7th prince of the Bolst kingdom. Davey, in turn, introduced himself simply, Davey Allen. Balan blinked in disbelief, baffled by the brevity. "Is that all?" he asked. Davey shrugged, wondering what more was expected. Pressing on, Balan asked why Davey was present at the gathering. With calm composure, Davey replied that he had come to watch his younger brother compete. Balan studied him for a moment, then gave a dismissive nod, wishing him a pleasant rest. His indifferent reaction left Davey more disappointed than anything else. The arrogant prince dropped to one knee before a startled Winry. Looking at the princess with a mixture of admiration and confidence, he declared that he would dedicate his victory in the tournament to her. Winry, pressing her hand to her forehead in exasperation, asked the prince if he truly understood how inappropriate it was to say such things in front of the entire audience. The smug, red-haired boy replied smoothly, insisting there was no reason for her to take offense if his words were true. Enraged, Winry retorted that her twin brother Varys was also competing in the tournament, and that the prince's declaration sounded insulting and dismissive toward him. Taking her brother's arm, she urged him to leave with her, while Prince Balin remained on one knee, left behind and humiliated as Winry's displeasure lingered in her eyes. Davey quietly observed, noting how much Winry had matured, though his thoughts soon shifted toward Prince Balin. Watching the boy, Davey realized that nothing would likely deter such a brazen individual. His suspicion proved correct, as the red-haired prince quickly rose and followed after the princess, scolding her for daring to look down on him. Davey had tolerated much already, but his patience was thinning. When Balin stretched out a gloved hand toward Winry, Davey suddenly tripped him, catching the prince's arm mid-fall with a vice-like grip. Smiling coldly, Davey remarked that the prince's hand must have slipped. As Balin screamed in pain, Davey watched his trembling hand with satisfaction, questioning silently what gave him the right to touch another man's beloved sister. Releasing his grip, Davey left the prince on the floor, clutching his injured arm. With a sharp tone, Davey asked Balin where his so-called honor was now. Enraged, Balin lashed out toward Davey, only for the protagonist to feel a sharp slap at the back of his neck. Turning in surprise, he noticed a white glove on the ground. The furious prince shouted, declaring a formal challenge to a duel, which immediately drew the attention of everyone nearby. Winry rushed to intervene, demanding what Balin thought he was doing. Yet through gritted teeth, the red-haired prince insisted she stay out of it, claiming it was a matter of knightly honor. One of the noble ladies in attendance stepped forward, declaring that Balin's behavior was disgraceful. The woman, adorned in a flowing white gown, fixed the prince with her piercing amber eyes. Caught off guard, Balin faltered as she questioned whether his actions truly gave him the right to speak of honor. Davey stood frozen, recognizing the woman with disbelief. She was none other than Princess Elena of the Palin Empire and the current disciple of the legendary sword god, Horus. Horus was a figure of ancient renown, the first wielder of the divine sword Calderas, the founder of the devastating two-handed sword style, and one of the greatest heroes born from the Palin Empire, one of the three most powerful states on the continent. His techniques were said to be as fluid as waves one moment, yet as immovable as stone the next, giving him the rightful title of sword god. Snapping back to reality, Davey glanced again at the red-haired princess. Whispering under his breath, he wondered aloud if she was truly the emperor's favorite. The moment the words left his lips, he cursed himself for his carelessness. Elena's sharp gaze shifted toward him, her amber eyes narrowing as she demanded to know what he had just said. Flustered, Davey stammered nervously, fumbling over excuses. She studied him in silence, her disbelief clear, until Davey laughed weakly and admitted it was all a mistake. With a foolish smile, he apologized, relieved when she finally seemed to let it go. Before he could collect himself, Varys approached, the green-haired youth winking at his brother as he asked what had just happened. Meanwhile, Princess Elena continued to scold Prince Balin. The humiliated boy stood rigid, his expression darkening as the princess's commanding presence weighed down on him. With an air of authority, she ordered him to apologize to both Winry and Davey. Balin's jaw clenched, his fury simmering as his pride battled against her demand. Davey, arms folded, simply watched with amusement, knowing full well the arrogant prince was unlikely to submit so easily. The leg twitched slightly as Davey grinned with a malicious edge. Facing the insolent man, he boldly declared that he accepted the challenge, his words instantly discouraging the arrogant prince and his sister. Balin glanced back at Daredevil in panic, but Davey fixed him with a sly look, making it clear he wouldn't allow him to simply retreat. Elena, worried, tried to dissuade him, but Davey calmly replied that he would make his own decisions. Picking up a white glove from the floor, Davey asked if Balin had truly issued him a challenge. The prince, though timid, gave an affirmative answer. Davey's lips curved into a satisfied smile as he remarked that in that case, he would gladly accept. Holding a wooden sword in his hands, Davey thought to himself that it had been a long time since he had used such a weapon. Barris grew anxious, worried about his brother being drawn into a duel against another contestant, while Winry looked at Davey with almost reverent faith. To ease her worry, Davey gently patted her head, telling her not to concern herself. The red-haired prince mocked him, claiming Davey's skill was likely no higher than that of a novice, then sneered that it would be best if he simply surrendered. Smugly, Balin declared that if Davey fell to his knees and admitted defeat, he would mercifully overlook the insult. Varys turned toward the impudent prince with irritation, attempting to calm him, but Davey merely asked him to stop. Slinging the wooden sword over his shoulder, Davey declared that he himself would judge the duel. Elena, realizing it was useless to interfere, could only watch silently. With a malicious grin, Balin promised that if he were to lose, he would kneel and apologize before everyone. Davey firmly warned him to remember those words, so he wouldn't attempt to take them back later. The two combatants stood facing one another, wooden swords in hand, waiting for the duel to begin. Davey looked briefly at his siblings, wondering where to start. He didn't wish to reveal his true strength in public, preferring to maintain the image of a weak prince who had only recently awakened from a coma. Standing on one leg, Davey wrapped his sword around his body, an odd stance that made Balin burst into laughter. The prince taunted him, asking if he had already lost his nerve. Spreading his arms, the red-haired youth declared that he was generously giving Davey the first move. But impatience got the better of him, and he soon shouted at Davey to stop stalling and attack. At last, Davey recalled a clever trick. Leaping into the air, he mockingly begged his opponent not to give up. Dropping down suddenly, he sprinted forward with blinding speed. Balin had not anticipated such swiftness, and in an instant Davey was upon him, eyes blazing as he raised his wooden sword and delivered a powerful strike. The bewildered prince barely had time to react before the weapon was knocked from his hands. Calling Davey a fool, he glared with contempt, only to be slapped hard across the face a moment later. His sword flew away as he screamed in pain. Davey, feigning innocence, remarked that his arm had simply slipped. In the next heartbeat, Balin was sprawled across the red carpet, his weapon landing beside him. With a sneer, Davey mocked that the prince hadn't even bothered to dodge. The remark infuriated Balin, who remained on the floor, teeth clenched. The crowd whispered among themselves, shocked at the stark difference in skill. Humiliated and unwilling to be branded a disgrace, Balin snatched up his weapon and roared that he would kill Davey. The protagonist only smirked, remarking that a prince with such a predictable style could never overcome improvisation. Their wooden swords clashed violently, the blows so fast they left pale streaks in the air. Each strike was merciless, echoing through the hall. Balin snarled, baring his teeth as he desperately parried another of Davey's attacks. Watching him closely, Davey noted how unstable the prince's stance was, his power uneven and his timing sloppy. Their weapons locked once again, Balin forcing Davey's sword aside with all his strength, determined not to lose to someone like him. Yet fear and strain were already evident in the red-haired prince's amber eyes, while Davey's figure loomed, preparing to deliver another sweeping strike. Blood sprayed through the air as Balin, bewildered, realized that for some reason he still couldn't land a single punch on his opponent. The guests of the grand ball, gathered for the fencing competition, looked down from above, watching the fierce duel between the two young men. Balin was knocked from his feet, collapsing onto the floor as he clutched his face in pain, while Davey stood tall and unshaken. The black-haired prince, calm and composed, asked if he had struck the target once again. In response, he received nothing more than a crude insult. Balin stared up at him, wide-eyed with disbelief. Murmurs spread among the audience as whispers echoed through the hall. None of them recognized this side of Balin, the man once regarded as a mere entry-level expert. When someone in the crowd muttered that Balin wasn't as skilled as expected, the red-haired prince's face twisted with fury. He clenched his jaw and, in a fit of anger, slammed his fist into the floor, shouting for the spectators to remain silent and to stop speaking of matters they did not understand. Still gasping for breath, Balin stayed down, struggling to recover. Davey, gazing down at his opponent with a mix of pride and coldness, thought to himself that he understood Balin perfectly. His rival had simply lost his composure, overtaken by nerves. As Davey's hand brushed the hilt of his sword, he reminded himself of the very style he had trained so hard to master, a style infamously known as the intoxicated sword. True to its name, it mimicked the erratic movements of a drunkard. This peculiar swordsmanship had been born from an unlikely collaboration created by Dune, a legendary drunkard turned hero, and Harris, who studied drunken brawlers out of sheer curiosity. The result was a form of sword art so unorthodox and chaotic that many considered it no better than heresy. Davey recalled his childhood training, when he practiced under a man who laughed as he explained that, although he had created this style, it was perhaps the worst of all. With a cold expression, Davey remembered Dune, a grown man in long green robes and flowing hair, laughing uncontrollably as Harris scolded that Dune was right. Harris had warned young Davey never to use this style unless he was prepared to bear the consequences, even to the grave. Placing a hand on the boy's forehead, Harris had sternly reminded him that a true swordsman must have a conscience. Those words lingered in Davey's mind. Even the two creators of the technique openly ridiculed it, branding it a forbidden sword art. But Davey had never fully understood their reasoning. Was it because the style was clumsy and crude, or because it was simply too effective, bordering on invincible? Whatever the case, he had dismissed their warnings long ago. Snapping back to the present, Davey effortlessly blocked Balin's strike, leaving his red-haired opponent dumbfounded. With a sudden twist, Davey's hand whipped across, delivering a stinging slap to Balin's face. He reflected that the style's true reason for being forbidden was clear. Every motion relied on deceit, feints, and tricks that seemed cursed. As Balin rubbed his chin in humiliation, Davey continued his thoughts. This wasn't a style meant for noble deeds, nor for saving lives or even taking them. It was a weapon designed to disgrace an opponent before the eyes of others. In truth, it was a demonic art. Resting his sword casually across his shoulders, Davey smiled faintly. This style forced enemies to lower their guard, luring them into mistakes, then punishing them with precise and devastating blows. It was simple yet brutally effective. First crush the opponent's spirit, then bring them to the ground. Summoning his strength, Balin charged again, but the result was the same. Davey, calm and composed, easily sent him sprawling once more. And as more eyes fell upon the spectacle, the technique only grew more powerful. With his head held high, Davey struck Balin again and again, while the gathered crowd gasped in shock. Letting out a sigh, Davey remarked with biting irony that he couldn't quite tell whether he was blessed with extraordinary luck, or if his opponent was simply hopeless. Looking at the battered prince before him, Davey even asked if he was all right, though his words carried more mockery than concern, for the last strike had landed with a resounding force. Smiling lightly, Davey concluded that this style truly suited him. Not because it was noble or honorable, but because, above all, it was far more fun. Nina Delan stood with her arms crossed, watching the fight with a stern and sullen expression. Suddenly, Balin's sword gleamed with a blue aura. His eyes widened as he leapt from the ground, brandishing the glowing weapon. Shouting at Davey, who was caught off guard by this sudden turn of events, Balin declared that he would finish the duel. Both Ree and Bar opened their mouths in shock, stunned that Balin had managed to channel mana into his sword, doubting his sanity for doing so. Ignoring the voices shouting that no deaths should occur in this duel, Balin's lips stretched into a manic smile. Renewed strength surged through him as he rushed forward with reckless abandon. Baris cried out desperately for his brother, but Davey remained composed. He reasoned that if he accidentally struck with too much force again, the audience might become suspicious. Moreover, Il and Princess de Palan's piercing gaze had been fixed upon the back of his head for some time, burning with scrutiny. Davey calmly took a step back as Balin advanced with a sinister chuckle. his eyes glittering like a man consumed by madness. The blue mana-infused blade stopped mere centimeters from Davey's face, yet Davey did not flinch. In the next instant, something so swift occurred that it was impossible to perceive with the naked eye. A faint wisp of white steam rose from the red-haired youth's weapon. Balin froze in shock. As he tried to comprehend what had happened, Davey suddenly appeared at his side. Prince Ron broke into a cocky grin, silently mouthing something. Balin's expression stiffened. He knew instantly that he had been mocked. Furious, the red-haired prince cursed aloud, but before he could act further, Davey tripped him. The spectators fell silent, anticipation tightening in the air. Varys cried out once more to his brother, who now found himself sprawled on the floor. Horrified, Balin stared up at Davey towering above him, only to jolt when a sword slammed into the carpet just centimeters from his face. Sweat beaded on Balin's forehead as his gaze darted to the blade beside him. Davey, sighing, rubbed his lower back and muttered in discomfort, his face flushing crimson as a sudden laugh escaped him. Nearly losing his balance, he stumbled but quickly straightened. The spectators, watching intently, wondered why Balin remained on the ground. Davey glanced down at his opponent's fallen sword, then turned to the audience with pride, boldly declaring his victory. The hall erupted in cheers.